Stephen, I'd like for you to address question number 2 first. How did national forces such as redlining, the Bracero program, etc., help lay the groundwork for the Eastside's political awakening?
Thanks for the question. You know, it's a complicated question. And as I was thinking about this in advance, you know, it occurred to me, I think we probably should establish first what we mean by awakening, right? Alex already mentioned this in his remarks, that there, you know, was significant political organizing and political activism in the San Jose area well in advance of, say, the 1950s and the 1960s. And, you know, one of the things I explored in my work was 19th century political activism among Mexicans and Mexican Americans and other Latinos, including Chilenos. So I have some reluctance about the term awakening. It kind of, you know, implies, as also José was just, you know, suggesting, that people had been asleep before and then they kind of woke up. And there's something very, I think inadvertently discriminatory in the terminology if we're not careful. But I will say that I think that, it's clear that the East Side certainly generated lots and lots of political organizing energy and activity after World War II. And so if we think about that period, I suppose in some ways we could call it some kind of a surge of political activity. Before this period of the late 1940s and the 1950s, I think the community had been much more transient than it would be later. There were fewer formal institutions on the East Side itself that gathered people together. There was deep economic poverty, and it was largely an immigrant community in the years prior to World War II. Now, even then, before the 1940s and 50s, there was politics, including radical politics there. There were mutual aid organizations, there were wildcat strikes happening in fields and canneries, there was involvement in Mexican transnational political activity. But after the war, I think people did become much more active politically on the East Side. In thinking this through, I guess I would suggest there might have been 5 or 6 broad reasons for why that happened in roughly the 1950s. First, I think people began spending more and more people began spending more and more time in East San Jose after World War II. The community was growing. The Bracero program allowed agricultural growers throughout the state who had once been hiring East San Jose residents to seasonal jobs throughout the state in agriculture, to hire fewer of them and to instead hire contracted braceros in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. So more and more of those people began to spend in East San Jose began to spend more time year-round in the San Jose area and not go out to the Central Valley or go to Salinas or go to the Imperial Valley or elsewhere to work. So that's one, I think, important dimension, is that there is a kind of gathering of people and a growth of the community. Some of this is also driven, as was suggested by José, by things like redlining and other restrictions that kept Mexicanos and Mexican Americans from moving to many other parts of the city. And so East San Jose is just growing. And with that come Spanish language newspapers and radio shows and other things. So culture and community are growing together. So I guess that would be one thing I would say for a broad force driving the political moment of the immediate post-war period. The second, I guess, might be there's a new focus in this period on equality, on political equality, on the abolition of racial and economic discrimination in the United States in these years of economic growth in the United States generally after 1945. Remember that the United States is coming out of the Depression, and there's lots of focus in these years in the late 40s and early 50s on the rise of a middle class, all this language about equality. We know that's a lot of rhetoric in many cases, but it's out there in politics. There's new suburbs that are emerging in the San Jose area and elsewhere with great sidewalks, right? Fancy new public schools, grassy lawns, and so forth. And so in this kind of context, people begin to ask questions, equality-based questions. What about San Jose, East San Jose rather? Why is there this sharp distinction between the lived experiences of residents in East San Jose and people in other parts of the county. So that might be number 2. Number 3, I might point to the new expectations of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in this period who had themselves gone through wartime. You know, they've been part of the World War II generation. And like African Americans and others in the United States, in the aftermath of World War II, people began to ask these questions about equality. They had fought against fascism abroad. Many of them had thought that they were fighting for freedom and equality at home. And in returning to the home front or living on the home front in the years after World War II, they raised hard questions and made real critiques of the inequality they found in East San Jose. Some of them, you know, really expressed a new citizenship politics that may or may not have always been about being a U.S. citizen, but it was more about being a member of a community. And so there's this sense in East San Jose of the late 40s and throughout the 50s of being a member of a place based on your residency in the neighborhood. Again, you don't have to necessarily be a U.S. citizen, but you're part of the East Side. And José, I think, was referring to this a little bit in terms of a sense of a common culture that's emerging in this period. And I think that is tied up with a kind of post-World War II generation of people who feel that they're a dignified group of people who deserve rights in this period. You know, my fourth of 5 big causes might be that I think in this period there are new key institutions in the San Jose area that are paying attention to the East Side and paying attention to Mexican Americans, Chicanos, in this period. In the years before the 1940s, there were much fewer big institutions that were paying attention to our communities. But after World War II, institutions like the Catholic Church, and again, José mentioned the Bracero movement, be a slightly later example of this, begin to pay much more attention to what's going on with Mexican Americans and to express concern about Mexican American well-being. Labor unions as well. There's more care from labor unions in the 40s and 50s than there had been in, say, the 20s and the 30s. Labor unions in the post-World War II period weren't always particularly friendly towards Mexicans and Mexican Americans, but I think they were less racist and less xenophobic than they had been in the years immediately before World War II. And so you do see people like, you know, Father Donald McDonald and other members of the mission band, Catholic priests, who are working on behalf of the East Side and other similar communities. And then my final suggestion is that what underlay the kind of the politics of the period was also the development of a Mexican-American civil rights period, the development of a Mexican-American civil rights movement, not just in San Jose, but elsewhere in the United States during this period. In East San Jose, we certainly see that happening. You know, I think the most important organization in the post-war period really was the Community Service Organization, which takes off in East San Jose in the early 1950s. And that organization is tied up with political developments among Chicanos in other parts of the country. It's connected with politics in Chicago. It's connected, the CSO is connected to East Los Angeles and efforts there to elect Mexican-American officials. It's connected also to mutual aid organizations and mutual aid efforts among Mexican-Americans throughout this period and before. It's connected to the Catholic Church. It's connected to anti-communism. It's connected to women's activism in the late 40s and early 50s and the activism of Mexican-American in particular. So in many ways, these kinds of things, I think, define or kind of set the stage for the political activism that would emerge in the 1940s and 50s. I could say more about the 60s and 70s, but I think I'll stop there and turn it over to other people. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Alejandro?
I'm not sure what else to say. I think you covered everything. But yeah, I think when I heard the question, one of the things that kind of struck me was right that the way the question was posed, right, that there's these national forces, and right, the question asks, right, how do these national forces lay the groundwork? And I don't think that the forces lay the groundwork. People lay the groundwork. People do the effort. People do the work. And it's actually right, these national policies and these national laws that actually set the conditions that create right, inequality, that create a sense of not belonging, that then people respond to. This is the 1930s. This map was drawn in 1939 from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which surveyed over 200 cities in the United States, and this is kind of where you get the term redlining. More often than not, you have that term in reference to African Americans, Black Americans, and how they were discriminated against and how they were not allowed to live in particular cities or in particular towns. This is right the red line map of San Jose. San Jose never had a very large Black community, and so what you see in all the areas that are marked in red, those are actually a lot of areas where there were Latinos, where there were Mexican Americans living, also Asian Americans. During the late 1930s, you also have Europeans that are not necessarily considered to be white during the time. So a lot of these areas, when you look at the descriptions, it says this is a mixed race neighborhood where you have Portuguese people, you have Slavic people, you have Italian people. And so it's important to note, right, that redlining didn't just affect African Americans or Black Americans, but it also separated people of it also separated other ethno-racial minorities. And in particular in San Jose, it impacted Latinos the most. If you look at kind of the top right, what I did in my work was try to see how, right, an issue like redlining impacted the segregation in San Jose. So the two neighborhoods that I looked at, right, were kind of the Eastside, and so you can kind of see that the Eastside really wasn't a part of San Jose during the late 1930s and 1940s. It's not even on the map, right? You have a very small corner. You only have two small neighborhoods, right, that are kind of considered to be part of the city during that time. That area that I called El Ganso is a reference to what was an Italian neighborhood referred to as Goosetown during the time. By the late 1950s, you have an influx, though, of Mexican Americans, Mexican immigrants that are residing in the downtown area. And so you can say that by the 1970s, right, the area wouldn't be called El Ganso anymore, but it was called, or it wasn't called Goosetown, but you could refer to it as El Ganso because whites were moving out of the area and you had Latinos moving into the area. So this is a map from the late 1930s. If you go to the next map. So this was in 1939. If you go to the second map. So this is a map from 1950. And as you can see, those two areas, right, the east side is still like predominantly not part of the city. Then you have the central area of the city. You have those little orange spots. Those are neighborhoods that were considered to be Latino neighborhoods. This map is taken from the 1950 census. There were over 52 census tracts that were taken. And there were 14 out of those census tracts that were marked as Latino neighborhoods. Those 14 tracts were documented as having 250 or more Spanish surname people living in those neighborhoods. And these are only about 7 of them. But the majority, right, there's only 3 that are located in what would have been East Side, and the rest of them were actually located along First Street in downtown. So when you talk about people doing the work, although you do not have people officially living in the city, right, there are people living on the East Side. And as Stephen Petey kind of pointed out, right, those communities are more transient. Those are more farm working people that are coming in and out to work in the canneries or working in agricultural fields kind of in the northern part of the county in cities like Mountain View, Sunnyvale. But you have a settled community living in San Jose in the 1950s, and they're very much a middle class. And as a middle class, right, kind of part of this growing middle class across the country, they view themselves as being part of the general U.S. society. And they see themselves as being active participants and active members of the city. And so the political groundwork actually comes from this awakening, this realization that they're part of the middle class, and that they need to assert their rights and that they actually deserve the equality that comes with, right, being a U.S. citizen. Again, as Professor Pease mentioned, in the 1950s, you have people who are coming back from World War II. You have people who are coming back from working in war industries. And as being part of the war effort, they view themselves very much as being part of the general U.S. society, as being part of the country. And when you have places not allowing you to eat in the restaurant, when you have places that are denying people to be buried in their cemeteries, there's this desire to fight against that. And so I think it's important, right, just to kind of reiterate what I stated, that people lay the groundwork, people do the work. And it's government policies and its government laws that set the conditions for people to respond to addressing inequality. And if you go just to the very last map, again, right here you kind of see what the Eastside grows to. This is a census map from the 1980s, from 1980. And so you can see that the population of Latinos in the downtown area, in the center of San Jose, doesn't really grow as much after 1970. And it kind of maintains its population, but the size of the Eastside geographically and even in numbers grows tremendously from 1950 to 1980.